What's up, everybody? It's Dr. Z, Dr. Zubin Damania. Come on in. I'm going to pull up your comments here. It's the middle of the day on July 27th, 2020, the best year in remembered history, isn't it? This year is just so amazing. It just keeps getting better and better and better. From COVID to murder hornets to Tiger King to, the apex of civilization, Eurovision Song Contest, the story of Fire Saga. If you haven't seen that, you're missing out on something amazing, okay? I saw you, and then all of my nights turn morning. You need to watch it. I'm going to pull up your comments here, and I'm going to share this to my good friend Doc Vader's page against his wishes. We are not the same person, contrary to popular belief. Hang on, give me 1 second, and I'm going to take your questions, and we'll have some fun. Share now. There we go. All right. Vader's audience is now engaged. Let's take some questions. Selena Hernandez says, hello, huge fan. That's not a question, Selena, but I will take it because it's awesome. Let me see. My thing is frozen here. Here we go. Debbie Nguyen says, what is the incidence of contracting COVID again after recovery? All right, so let's be very careful in answering this question. Incidence means how often per a period of time do we see something occur? Now, the truth is we don't know what the new incidence is of reinfection because it's very difficult to define what a reinfection is. You can be infected the first time, go through the disease, and then the question is reinfection defined by testing positive again after you once tested negative? Well, if that's the case, it could be a false positive in the test. It could be the test is picking up RNA fragments of the virus that actually don't indicate active infection, but would cause the test to become positive, in which case you're misdiagnosing somebody as a reinfection when in reality, it's just an artifact of how we test. Or is it that they actually are again infected with the same strain of coronavirus that caused their original infection, and they somehow did not develop immunity and are now suffering symptoms again? So those are things we have to think about when we talk about reinfection. We have all we're hearing is case reports right now of people who are getting, quote unquote reinfected, but we don't really know whether this is actually reinfection or whether there's one of these other things going on. Now, let's say it is reinfection and the case reports are not that many because, the truth is, like many coronaviruses, cold viruses, immunity judged by antibodies and things like that may not be that long lasting. So you could get reinfected, but the thought is that even if you do, the second infection will not be as serious as the first because you'll mount a memory immune response that may not be mediated by these things called antibodies. It may be something that's more cellular mediated, like T cells, which we talked about in a separate video. In which case, there will still be some people who just simply don't mount a great immune response and get reinfected anyways. So you might end up with a handful of people, handful meaning a small minority of people who end up having that happen. But the ultimate truth is we don't really know the answer to this question yet because it's so early. We don't know that people are really getting, now there have been some reports and so on, but we don't know how extensive this is. Now, it becomes an issue because if you can just get reinfected all the time, well, then a vaccine is going to be pretty tough to pull off because the idea is you develop immunity. Unless the vaccine is better at creating immunity than being infected with the quote-unquote wild-type virus, the circulating virus. Now, the other way that reinfection can occur is if the virus mutates enough that you then the immunity that you've mounted no longer applies to this mutated virus that has different proteins on its surface or whatever it is that it's doing. Well, that has not been seen yet in terms of a cause of reinfection in coronavirus. We haven't yet documented mutations that actually necessarily change the immunogenicity of the virus, meaning what part of the immune system it's interacting, what are the surface proteins that interact with the immune system. We have seen some drift in the virus in terms of the predominant strain worldwide. There's one in particular that seems to be very successful at spreading more, but we don't know about how it interacts with the immune system directly. With influenza, the reason we have to get re-immunized every year is that the surface proteins change enough that you need to predict, okay, what's going to happen this year and what should we immunize against? So that's just a constantly shifting virus. We're not seeing that as much with this particular coronavirus. And the other possibility is it's something like a strep bacteria that you can't really immunize against because you just don't develop the proper long-lasting immunity. I think that's less likely, actually, especially based on a piece that I did recently looking at T-cell mediated immunity. So very good question. Let's see if there's some other ones here. Nilanjan Mitra says, love from India, Doc. I'm tested positive for COVID and currently in home isolation. I have hemophilia. Is it considered as a comorbidity? What a great question, and thanks for hitting us up all the way from there. I hope you're doing okay. So, hemophilia is a blood disorder. There is some evidence that this virus interacts with our blood in a way that is interesting, to say the least. Blood clots, a predisposition for blood type A, an idea that there are endothelial, the cells that line our blood vessels have these ACE receptors that the virus targets to infect. So there's something going on with the blood and the hematologic system and this virus. So would hemophiliacs, such as yourself, have a higher risk? Would it be listed as one of the things that is a comorbidity, like you say, that puts you at higher risk? And the truth is, I don't know the answer to that specifically. If I were to speculate, I would say it's a pre-existing disease that, if we know anything about this virus, it's that it's really unpredictable. And I would say I would err on the side of caution and say, well, it probably is better not to have hemophilia if you're going to be infected with COVID-19 if you're looking at outcomes. So we don't know because I don't think it's been studied in hemophiliacs, right? But the question is, do you have a tendency to bleed? Do you have a tendency to clot? Those who have a tendency to clot are probably at higher risk in general from this virus because it has shown us that it generates a lot of thrombosis, which is the fancy word for blood clot. So either way, the simplest things to do are obviously you're self-isolating. If you have significant shortness of breath, if you can get one of those little probes that measure your oxygen at home, those are available now online, depending on cost, et cetera, and where you are in India. You can keep an eye on your blood oxygenation levels, but the main things you want to look for are real bad shortness of breath, right? Extremities turning blue, which is a sign, again, of low blood oxygen levels. Brain fogginess to the point where family members are concerned about you, confusion, because that can be a sign of whether it's stroke, blood clot, or worsening infection, including sepsis. So these are like simple signs that you can look for that say you better seek medical attention, that being at home and self-isolating is no longer a good idea. Unable to keep fluids down, those kind of things are problematic. Now, other symptoms of things that you could have with COVID-19 that might be alarm signs, right? Especially if you're looking at bleeding issues. Well, obviously with you, bleeding, with others, blood clotting. So signs of stroke, arm weakness, face drooping, speech difficulties, balance and equilibrium problems, eye problems, vision problems. There's an acronym, right? B FAST. So balance, eye issues. F is facial droop. A is arm weakness, right? S is speech troubles. And T is time to call for help. So it's definitely important. And if you're a loved one, someone taking care of someone with COVID at home who's isolating, these are the things you really want to be vigilant for. Now, the shortness of breath issues are legitimate, right? And that's what often will cause the hospitalizations in a lot of people. The other issues that can happen are cardiac issues. So rhythm problems, chest pain, heart attacks, things like that seem to be in higher connection with the coronavirus. So that's the shortest long answer I can give you to that question. It's a great question, and I hope you do better. Suzanne Fleischman says, is there anything you can comment Oh, these comments roll so fast. Where did you go, Suzanne? Oh, it's gone. Hold on. Let me go back and see if I can find it on here. I'm sorry, Suzanne. I try my best, but these comments scroll so fast. I'm going to have to go to, oh, here it is. Here it is. Okay. Is there anything you can comment regarding COVID risk for a patient who suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome but recovered from Guillain-Barré with only minor residual effects? Suzanne. Okay. Let's talk about Guillain-Barré. GBS, Guillain-Barré syndrome, is a very unfortunate neurologic symptom that most people do recover from, but it can be an ordeal. And it is what they call an ascending paralysis, where you get progressive weakness that ultimately can affect your ability to breathe, to talk, to protect your airway, and can require intubation in the ICU. Now, a lot of times people talk about Guillain-Barré syndrome being associated with vaccines. So flu vaccine, et cetera, higher incidence of Guillain-Barré. But the truth is, that this is true, but it's also associated with actual infection. So viral infections can trigger Guillain-Barré syndrome. The flu is actually more likely to give you Guillain-Barré than the vaccine for the flu. This is something people don't realize. I did a video on this. So if you've had Guillain-Barré before, the question is, are you at risk to have it again from infection, vaccination, et cetera? And this is very controversial. I think a lot of physicians would say, yes, you have to be very careful because, again, it's such a serious disease that you have to exercise extreme caution. But there are also many who say, you know what, even with vaccination, it's not an absolute reason not to get vaccinated. Because, again, having it happen again, the actual disease that you can get can actually be a higher risk for Guillain-Barré. So the answer, again, with COVID is we don't know because we're not sure what the rates of Guillain-Barré with COVID are, but I bet they're non-zero because it is another viral infection. And a lot of viruses share this mechanism of immune reactivity that we may see. So that's my hand-waving answer to your Guillain-Barré. Hand-waving meaning we don't have enough data in COVID, but again, caution is the order of the day. The idea is not to get COVID. So you're trying your best not to get it. Are there any updates to increase levels of von Willebrand factor in COVID patients? Should our COVID patients be on prophylactic anticoagulants, Madeline He? So this is a question that has come up again and again and again, which is, again, we talked about the blood issues, hematologic issues with COVID-19 coronavirus. Von Willebrand's factor is this stuff that's, produced by the endothelium, I believe, in blood vessels. It's been a minute since I've looked at the pathophysiology of von Willebrand's factor, but it's involved in the clotting cascade. And there was some feeling with some data that there was some effect on von Willebrand's factor in coronavirus infection. And it was not a good effect. So whether it was leading to more clotting or better viral binding, we don't know. And again, I'm not fully versed in the literature on this particular topic, but I would say that nothing has come out yet that has convinced enough people that in other words, putting everybody, now let's be very careful. When we talk about anticoagulants for people who aren't, medical people, that means thinning the blood. Why would you thin the blood in COVID-19? Because we just talked about how it puts you at higher risk for blood clots. Now, any illness in the hospital can put you at higher risk for blood clots, and that includes deep venous thrombosis, blood clots in the legs or in major vessels, arterial thrombosis, which is a different kind of clot in arteries that can cause stroke and other issues like that, particularly when you have heart problems like atrial fibrillation or other arrhythmias in the heart. Pulmonary embolism, which is a blood clot that goes to the lung that can, again, all these things can be fatal. So in hospitalized patients, we often use prophylactic, meaning preventative blood thinning to lower the risk of blood clotting that comes with disease and immobility, not moving in hospitalized settings. Now, remember, there's a classic triad of things that can put you at risk for blood clots. They call it Virchow's triad, just described by, I assume, Virchow. And one of them is stasis. So the blood's just not moving much, so it has more tendency to clot. The second is damage to the actual blood vessel, so injury, because when you damage a blood vessel wall, you can trigger a clotting cascade. And the third thing is other genetic predispositions to hypercoagulability, to blood clotting. And that can be, medications, it can be illness like this disease, and it can be genetic predispositions. Like I have 2 heterozygous genetic predispositions to blood clotting, factor V Leiden and prothrombin 20210A. So I would be at high risk if I got COVID of blood clotting. So how would you manage a regular COVID patient? How would you manage me? Well, there's 2 ways to manage blood thinning, really. Let's keep it really simple. One is the prophylactic dose of blood thinners like low molecular weight heparin, Lovenox, and things like that just are designed to prevent you from getting a blood clot if you're at kind of average risk, right? Then the second way to do it is full anticoagulation dose blood thinners at a higher dose that really thin the blood. So people who have atrial fibrillation, who've had a history of blood clots or a current blood clot, you'd put them on the full dose. So the question in COVID patients has been, should we just start everybody on, because we should start most people on prophylactic dose blood thinners in the hospital to prevent clots that we would normally see. That's just a given already, assuming you don't have risk factors for bleeding or other reasons, hemorrhagic stroke, uncontrolled hypertension at very high levels that will put you at risk for bleeding, or you're taking medicines that would, really put you at high risk for bleeding. There's no reason not to do that, and we should be doing that. It's part of our protocols in most cases. But when do you put them on full strength blood thinners? And that becomes very tough because there are risks of full strength blood thinners. Hemorrhagic stroke, bleeding, in other words, bleeding in the brain, bleeding in the gut, bleeding in other parts of the body. They're not without risk. So we don't have a good answer for who we should put on full strength blood thinners yet. And you have to go on case by case. Like for me, if I got COVID and I was hospitalized with COVID, I'm not talking about outpatient, I'm at home self-quarantining. I would probably, if I were treating me, I would probably say, well, he's got a lot of risks. I would for sure put him on prophylactic, but I might even put him on full strength anticoagulation since I don't have any risks of bleeding. So those are things you kind of think about. Now people will ask, well, should you just take an aspirin? Should you do this? That's not going to help you. A baby aspirin for this kind of clotting is not going to help you, and it will put you at risk for other things like stress-related gastric ulcer bleeding and things like that. So I would not just go putting everybody on an aspirin thinking that they're going to prevent COVID-19 complications. It's not without harm, aspirin, as has been shown in studies. Jennifer Zuniga, please let me know what you are seeing as a relationship between COVID-19 and latent acute renal failure and C. diff. With latent acute renal failure and C. diff. So a relationship between COVID-19 with acute renal failure and C. diff. Okay, I'm not seeing that relationship. So let's just define a few things. COVID-19, we know. Acute renal failure is failure of the kidneys that happen quickly, not something that's been going on for a long time like people with chronic renal insufficiency, CRI. This is acute renal failure, and it often happens in patients with massive infections, COVID being no exception. And in fact, there's some feeling that COVID is even worse about kidneys, having maybe something to do with its cardiovascular effects, blood pressure effects, and the fact that it binds through the ACE2 receptor that also happens to be involved in blood pressure cascades and renal angiotensin stuff. So that being said, is there a relationship between COVID with renal failure and C. diff? C. diff is Clostridium difficile. It's an infection. It's a bacteria that creates spores that are very hard to kill that can infect your colon, so you can catch it from other people, but it's usually outcompeted in your colon by other bacteria and organisms that are naturally there. But what happens when you take antibiotics? Say you're in the hospital and they give you antibiotics to protect you against a bacterial pneumonia that you might get as a secondary complication of the viral pneumonia from COVID, from coronavirus. Well, in that case, you destroy your normal bacteria, and therefore this Clostridium bacteria can actually replicate without a lot of competition. And it creates a toxin, the C. diff toxin, that can cause massive diarrhea, inflammation, and sometimes bleeding in the large intestine, in the colon. And this can be life-threatening. You can actually get something called megacolon, toxic megacolon, which sounds like a metal band. And it can also cause obstruction and all kinds of terrible things that you don't want. But the diarrhea alone can cause problems with very high white counts and, massive amounts of really horrible diarrhea. So you want to avoid this, and it's hospital acquired a lot of the times, especially in the setting of antibiotics. Now, I have not heard of a specific relationship. It's probably out there. People have reported all kinds of things. I haven't heard of a specific relationship with C. diff and this. And in fact, if anything, I've been talking anecdotally to some of my colleagues who have said that what they're seeing is actually a little less C. diff. And some of that may be because we're now really anal about hygiene. Whereas before we were pretty bad as frontline healthcare workers at washing our hands. Turns out Purell does not kill C. diff spores. You have to actually wash your hands and wear the gloves and the gowns and all that. And people are doing that much more effectively now. So it might be that we're actually seeing anecdotally from my friends. And I remember, this is not a study. This is just you asked what we're seeing. This is what we're seeing is actually maybe even a little less C. diff in the orgs that I've talked to. So great question. Let's see what people are saying here. People talking to each other, which is great. Farida is being very nice to me. Let's see. Opinion on frontline healthcare providers who are immunocompromised and on methotrexate, biologic steroids, continuing to stay frontline, Jen Pruitt. So Jen is asking about, who's a supporter of the show. Thank you for supporting the show, Jen. Actually, Jen, that reminds me, so before I answer your question about that, this is a longer form live discussion that I just thought we'd do since it's Monday. I got dressed up for you guys because I figured why not? And it's cold in the Bay Area right now. Our supporter tribe on Facebook and YouTube, it's like $4.99 a month, and it can be different tiers on YouTube depending on what you want, is a great place to have discussions that are much more informal. We do them almost every night. We have a closed supporter tribe discussion group that's moderated only by me, so I keep it really lean. People are very nice to each other. We're passionate. It's a tribe of over 7,000 people, and I highly recommend you join if you want to go deeper on these things, and if you just want to support the things that you see on this show that you like, and have a place that's sucker-free where you can talk and be open and kind of plan the emergence of Health 3.0. All right, that out of the way. Jen, back to your question. That was my housekeeping and my pitch to you all that keeps the lights on at a time when everybody's struggling. This is a question that's very specific to individuals. So what level of risk are you willing to take? If you're immunocompromised on agents like biologic agents, steroids, that lower your immune response, you're at higher risk of getting a large amount of viral replication from an infection with coronavirus. So you are at higher risk. That is one of the comorbidities. Now, if you're a healthcare worker, you're at higher risk just being around so many COVID patients. But you also, if your organization has resourced you appropriately, have good PPE and the training on how to put it on and take it off, right, in a safe way. So the decisions ultimately are up to the person and how much risk they're willing to take. But we ought to be offering very generous sick time, leave, work from home options for people who are at risk, like those patients, who are also our frontline caregivers. So I think it's super important that we actually allow people who feel their risk is high to step aside and do something else on the to help that isn't their bedside care. Because you're asking someone to risk their life at a particular level that's beyond what the average person's risking their life in healthcare. You know, there's been about 1,200 healthcare worker deaths, I believe was the recent number that I saw in this country. And that's healthcare workers across the entire spectrum. That's way too many, right? So we are at a higher risk. Let's take some more comments. MIT researchers created a reusable face mask that works like an N95 respirator, Pamela Dwyer. There's a lot of people working on this, but still not enough PPE. You know, and this relates to like public masking. Like when we were talking about cloth masks and things like that, I just thought that was the stupidest thing ever. And it still is. Every American should be supplied with a supply of surgical grade masks. They're easier to breathe through. They work better. And if we're talking about universal masking, if everybody's wearing those, we're probably going to lower the reproductive number of the virus, and there's going to be less spread. But instead, we're asking people to wear scarves and bandanas. And I mean, you may look cool, but it's not going to help much. It's going to give you a false sense of security, and it'll help a little. Don't get me wrong. But, we should just man up and scale up production of this stuff, right? I mean, that's what I think. It should be easily available. Let's see. Walgreens sells them, right, Stephen Thomas? I mean, you can get them, right? But again, and we don't want to shortchange our frontline healthcare staff, which was the concern in the beginning, which is why there were so many mixed messages from large organizations like CDC and WHO. Diane Reed says, amen about surgical masks for everyone. Hey. And then there's not even any stratification by how cool you look in a mask. Everyone looks like an idiot in a surgical mask. It's a great equalizer. By the way, one thing I should mention, because Kevin Stansbury and others have sent stars. Stars are another way you can support our show, especially these live marathon sessions like this. You don't have to become a supporter. You can just click the stars icon, and I get a penny per star. Our show gets a penny per star, and I use it to support our team and all the gear and all the rent and everything in this space. And it's really, really helpful. And it's a way to show that you care about something we're saying, or, just at the end of it, I go through and I look through all the comments that are star comments first, because, they had enough care to actually send a little tip. It's like a little tip jar. So deeply appreciate those who are sending stars. And that's what that is. Facebook takes a cut. If you purchase a bunch of stars in advance, that cut is less. So you get more bang for your buck, and then you can give them to different creators. We're part of a beta, and there are other creators that are actually also part of this beta. So thank you to Amanda and Maureen and Deanna Davis sending stars. Why are people so angry right now? Steph NS. Oh, people are always angry. You'll see the little angry emojis anytime I open my mouth. Does it need to say surgical mask on the packaging? Evan Fox. This is a good question, actually. How do you actually define a surgical mask? Give me 1 second. I'm going to be right back. I'm going to be right back. All right. Here we are. So I got a couple surgical masks here. And these were given out at Stanford, and my wife brought a couple home. Everybody at Stanford, all staff and patients, are given masks. So there's universal masking, and there's been a very low rate of healthcare workers there getting COVID who are complying with this. There were a few infections in clerical staff who were not masking and not social distancing within the actual hospital. So I think universal masking can go a long way. The Koreans showed this as well. So these masks, they have a particular type of filtration, and when you put it on, there's a little metal thing at the top. Whoops, there we go. And you look like an idiot, but so what? And you want to tighten it down here and then stop touching it, pull it down under the bottom. And the main thing this thing does is prevents your own droplets from hitting other people, because it's really going to catch the majority of your droplets. You will get air coming in through the side. So it's not perfect, right? If there's airborne particles that are tiny, they can get in there. But it does provide some filtration even coming in. So you may lower the dose of virus that you get to a point where it's generating some immunity, but you don't get that sick. So I did a video on this. Now, what makes a surgical mask? I don't know, honestly. And I don't know how to identify them beyond, saying something on the package that says surgical grade or procedural mask. That's the other term that they use for these type of masks. I bet you'll see a lot of knockoff stuff online that's just paper, but this seems like it has a very different filtration. Now, looking at influenza in the past, in healthcare workers, surgical mask and N95 was really no different when you sent people out. There was a study on this in terms of their infection, even though influenza, can also be, quite aerosolized. So it's definitely better than most cloth masks, just by the function of the size of the pores of the mask and the coverage on the face. So something to think about. James Christensen, reduced expiratory droplets. Exactly. But also, people need to realize this. I'll tell you, there is a reduction in the actual internal, how much viral particles you're actually taking in. What's interesting is I think I did this wrong when I showed it to you briefly right now. I have this backwards. So that's the other thing, right? You want to make sure, like I'm doing it wrong. I'm a freaking doctor. You want this thing to actually face in the correct direction, and you'll see where the little tags are and, wear it correctly. So like such, pull the things over. Don't go touching the mask or your face. And when you take it off, pull it off like this. And don't touch the actual mask material, because there could be viral particles or droplets on there already. And then wash your hands. Social distance. It's totally not rocket science. It's very easy to do. Thanks for all the stars, you guys. Abigail and Audra and Jess. All right, let's see some other comments here. Robin Ivester. How will schools determine the difference between COVID-19, flu, and seasonal viruses? Without direction, kids will never be allowed to return. Robin Ivester. So Robin, I did a show recently saying that I agreed with the American Academy of Pediatrics that kids should physically be in school whenever possible. And since then, I've talked to a lot of teachers, and a lot of the logistics of how this works has become a little clearer to me. I still think kids should be back in school, and anything I can do to get my kids back in school, I would do, that makes sure we're balancing safety with the actual safety of our children, meaning they are losing their minds right now. There's more, I think, anxiety. Basically, try to get, I'm not saying this about my own children because they're actually doing okay, but you can tell they're in camp right now. And I put them in camp because their mental state is so much better. Being around other children, being with counselors who are face shielded and masked up, and engaging in socialization than sitting at home learning through a screen. And so the idea that trying to get an appointment with a child psychiatrist is almost impossible right now, because they're overwhelmed with the behavioral and mental health issues of children that are so off their routine and so in a different structure that's not conducive to them not going crazy. So I think it's important that we get kids back to school, but the points that you bring up are points that have been brought up to me that are very, very difficult. And one is, how do you protect teachers who are at risk? What's the transmissibility among kids? Well, there was recently, just now, a South Korean study that came out that showed kids under 10 not transmitting that much at all for virus. Kids over 10 to 18, more like adults in terms of what they transmit. Not likely to get very sick, but could give it to other vulnerable adults. So what's the answer? Well, for the younger kids, maybe you can be a little more lax on the kids having to wear masks, since they're not going to comply as much. You try, but make sure the teachers are protected. And then for the older kids, well, it's always going to be about distancing as much as you can, staggering the classes, and masking as much as you can with the older kids, just making it part of the culture that there's universal masking. And that would lower the amount of circulating virus and lower the risk as much as you can. Now, here's the question that you brought up that I think is very important. What happens when there's influenza or there's a cold and the kid's sniffling and has a fever? Well, kid has to stay home. Kid has to be tested. How are we going to make sure that happens? How are we going to communicate and contact trace and do all that? Is the whole class going to be shut down? Is the whole school going to be shut down if one kid gets sick? What are we going to do when a teacher gets sick? What are we going to do? And these are very, very difficult questions. They're not insurmountable problems, though. And smarter people than me who understand the logistics of school can actually come up with protocols and pathways for managing this if we're going to get kids back to school. There are some situations where it's so widespread in the community that school is going to be tough. And because you're just going to end up shutting down every single time, so many kids are going to get sick. And you look at Israel, and the Israelis report that, opening school was a mistake for them because A lot of kids got sick. Well, the truth is they didn't have the social distancing and universal masking in the school. So they didn't do it the way some Scandinavian countries say have done it, where it's been much better. So there's other countries that have had more success with opening schools. Now, again, when we're talking about the U.S., we've not had much success getting anything right except for scaling up testing finally. So it's a little tricky, but, and I'll tell you, my school district, San Mateo, California, is the only school district, is the only county in the Bay Area that isn't currently on a watch list by the state for having too many cases. So the current plan is they're going to do a hybrid in-person distance learning, which I think is a good idea. And I think it should also be the choice of the students and the teachers as to what they think is safest for them, weighing risk and benefit. Do I live with, abuela who's got diabetes and hypertension and would die if I made her sick, or not? And what's the risk tolerance of my family? And this is really tough. And then you have the flu. So of course, the problem is kids aren't getting vaccinated now because we're all scared of going to the doctor. But the truth is you're probably more likely to get it at a restaurant or something than you are at the doctor. At this point, everybody's universally masking, washing hands, and paranoid, except for the poor triage nurse who gets coughed on constantly. Let's see. Is it safe to babysit my 2-year-old grandson, Lisa Kupka? Depends, Lisa. How old are you? What are your comorbidities? What exposures does the grandson have? Because the grandson can still transmit asymptomatically or symptomatically COVID to you, coronavirus to you. So how comfortable are you with that? It's a tough question, right? My own parents are pretty much have been isolated the whole time, and they're on their, farm in Clovis, California, and they haven't seen any of us. It's been months. It's very hard. But my dad has, pulmonary comorbidities, cardiac comorbidities. So it's like, if he was hospitalized, my dad was hospitalized for pneumonia, a couple of years back, just after getting a cold. So he's not going to do well with coronavirus. So for us, the risk calculation is clear. Continue to stay distant, stay at home, wash hands, wear a mask when he goes out, that sort of thing. But he stopped seeing patients and that sort of thing because it was too risky, because he was doing disability vows and things like that. Okay, so L. Scott Ward. We are seriously worrying about a virus that has a 99.7% survival rate and that can be combated by washing our hands. Okay, so let's talk about this. This is really important. I have a lot of sympathies to that statement. I do. Here's the difficulty, Scott. And I've been saying this since the beginning, that you have to balance all these things. We cannot instill so much fear in the public that we act irrationally, which we've been doing on every level. All the anti-mask stuff, all the mask shaming, all the catastrophizing, all the politicization it's just so fatiguing. And it doesn't help. Just look purely at the science and understand risk. The biggest consensus right now on mortality has to do with a number around 0.6%, somewhere between 0.5 and 0.1 and 1%. So in other words, all comers, let's say 0.6% of them might die after being infected with this virus. Well, what's influenza at? And again, influenza is actually slightly overestimated probably in terms of its mortality because of the way they measure that data. But they say it's around, in a bad flu year, 0.1, at the worst 0.2. So you're at, 5 to 6 to 7 to 10 times as fatal as a flu. Now, the difference is influenza affects people of all ages. This particular virus seems to love the morbidly obese if you're young, anybody over 65, and anybody with 2 comorbidities at least. Now, one comorbidity put you at higher risk, but these are the people that it's really targeting, right? Diabetes, hypertension, lung disease, immunocompromised, these kind of things. So the concern is with those at-risk populations, this thing can be much more fatal than the average. At low-risk populations, this is like flu or better. So why is there so much freaking out? Well, it's because you can see what happens when masses of people do get exposed. The hospitals get overwhelmed, which means other people that don't have coronavirus cannot get care because all the ICUs are full. Now, people will say, no, this never really happened and this and that. The reason it never happened is that people auto-regulate and governments intervene in a way that bends the infection curve. We've never seen unmitigated spread of this virus. Now, like you said, hand washing. So yeah, people started washing their hands. People social distance. We stopped large gatherings. We closed a lot of businesses. We closed the schools. People started masking. Well, all those things contribute to lowering the reproductive number of the virus so that there's less spread, which means we then see the success of that. The numbers drop. And then what happens is we go, oh, see, it wasn't that bad. And then we start to open again, and what did we see? And even I was skeptical about this. I was like, we're probably just seeing young people getting sick, which is true. But what about the death rate? Well, now the death rate's rising. And now the hospitals are getting very, very busy in places like Texas. We're seeing cases go up because unlike a flu that spread over a season and so on, and there's some innate immunity in the population, this one has less of that. It's a new virus, even though there is some innate immunity, we think, T-cell immunity to coronaviruses from previous, whether it's SARS, other unknown animal coronaviruses, or the common cold, there's some innate immunity that puts some people in an asymptomatic category that then can spread the disease but don't actually get sick. So now what you see is hospitals get overwhelmed, and then it raises the death count in other ways. But the problem is our response to it has to be a balanced response, not fear-driven, but science-driven, which means, okay, let's weigh what happens when you shut the economy down, diseases of despair, substance abuse, domestic abuse, et cetera. It happens when you shut schools down, mental illness in children, domestic abuse, child abuse. Okay, poor education, recurring cycles of poverty and violence. Okay, well, what happens when you close businesses down? Well, again, problems. Economic problems can become health problems. People lose their health insurance. Now what? Now we have medical problems. So you have to balance that with the medical issues here. And the bottom line is, in my opinion, at this point, the balance is this. And you kind of nailed it, Scott. Wash your hands, wear a mask when you can't socially distance, social distance, hold off on the large gatherings and things like that if you can't protect yourself. And that's probably going to do it. We're not doing that. A lot of places in the country where you're seeing surges of cases is people just aren't doing those simple, easy things. So then the government talks about doing these draconian shutdowns and things like that. Now, again, then you have all the predictable consequences of that, which I think are very, very bad. So let's take the politics out of it. Let's take the fear out of it, and let's just look at it as, okay, how do we help the most people for the least cost in the least amount of time? And I think it's masking, social distancing, washing your hands, and testing so that you can then self-quarantine when you test positive. So that's my take on that. Kristen Landam, in your opinion, is there any hope for herd immunity with schools reopening? Do you think kids would be a good avenue to achieve the magic number? Cardiology PA and mom of 2 girls, 2 and 6 in Alabama here. Kristen, thanks for your question and for your work as a PA. All right. I've always still want to do my parody Magnum PA as a tribute to PAs. So herd immunity. Let's quickly talk about this. I've done a video on this, but let's do a brief synopsis of that. Herd immunity, I prefer the term community immunity because it's less like we're a bunch of sheep, because the anti-vaxxers love to say, look at the sheeple and the herd following the lemmings off a cliff. Community immunity is when you reach enough resistance to a particular viral or bacterial organism in the community that the organism has nowhere to go. So let's say I get infected because I can't be vaccinated or I'm just particularly susceptible to this virus. Now I'm sick. Well, normally I'd be able to give it to everyone around me because they'd be susceptible. But in the case of community immunity, they've either already had the disease and developed immunity, or they've been vaccinated and developed immunity. So there's a shield around me that prevents that virus from going anywhere. So it falls after I get better or die, it can't reproduce. And so it starts to peter out in the public. That's why we need like 95% vaccination rates for things like measles that are so infective that if you don't reach that level of herd immunity, people are so susceptible and it's so contagious that you will continue to spread the disease. That's why anti-vaccine sentiment is so dangerous for public health, right? Even though I'm sympathetic to the ideas of this is my body, I have my choice, I want to know what goes in it, I don't trust big pharma or corporations or government, I get all that. I get it. But the science simply says, and people say, well, the science is never settled. You're right, it's never settled. But we constantly are looking at it. Scientists don't want to injure you. They really don't. They really don't. In fact, it's the worst possible thing they can imagine. So despite what the conspiracy people will say. So herd immunity means you've either reached some threshold where that virus has nowhere to go and it peters out. What's the herd immunity threshold for coronavirus? This is the billion-dollar question. Let's start at the beginning and say what actually influences the herd immunity threshold? What would make it different? Let's say everybody in the public is, if they get a whiff of this virus, they are going to get infected and be able to spread it to other people. Well, then your herd immunity threshold is close to 100. Like almost everybody has to be immune or not quite 100. It needs to be very high because to create a shield around one particular person who got infected, everyone around them needs to be immune, or else another person's going to be infected and the reproductive number is going to be at least one, right? So it'll continue to propagate, and stay at the same pace. But this disease, SARS-CoV-2, is not 100% susceptibility to people. In fact, there's data to suggest that many people have pre-existing T-cell mediated memory immunity to this coronavirus from years of being infected with colds, coronaviruses, or other issues that create immunity. So there's not equal susceptibility. Age changes the susceptibility. Young people maybe have less ACE receptors or different medium for infection, not as infectious or not able to get infected as easily as we talked about with school. So that lowers the amount of people that need to be immune in order to, or need to have been infected in order to achieve herd immunity, because people who haven't been infected are already resistant. So there's been speculation that number for coronavirus is 60, 70% in the absence of innate sort of resistance. But there's some evidence out of Glasgow, and I did a show on this, that actually there's more innate resistance to this than we think. In which case, as the infection tears through the population of susceptible people, it finds hosts everywhere because no one's really, in other words, we haven't been vaccinated. So there's plenty of hosts. But when it reaches a threshold of, say, 20% of people infected, those are the low-hanging fruit for that virus. Now it's much harder for the virus to find a host that isn't innately resistant in some way, but just by nature of who they are or their previous exposures to other viruses, or their age. At that point, it peters out. So herd immunity threshold may be closer to 20%, in which case you could say, well, we're going to get there at some point. We're not really there in most places. And that means that to get to herd immunity by natural infection, you're going to cost the lives of the people who die from the disease. That's why vaccines are vastly preferable, assuming they're safe and effective, are vastly preferable to natural infection in this case. So we don't know the answer. If we get the kids in school, well, how big of vectors of herd immunity are there? I suspect the older kids are more important because they're more of a reservoir of transmissibility than the younger kids, which is different than flu and stomach viruses and things like that. So that's my thing on herd immunity. Ashley says she's asked a bunch of times the same question and hopes I see it, but now I got to see what it is. And I don't Let me scroll back because now I'm curious what these comments just go pop, 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 pop. Let me see if I can see it on the computer. Okay, here it is. Ashley, should we prepare for a second lockdown in fall, or will there be a vaccine treatment in the fall? I know doctors were saying they know how to treat it better than in March, but what does that mean in terms of another lockdown? What a great question, Ashley. I'm glad you were persistent. All right. I'm going to have Paul Offit on the show on Friday. You guys have seen him on my show 3 times now, twice around coronavirus. He is a vaccine inventor, invented the rotavirus vaccine, co-invented the rotavirus vaccine, is a world famous dude on science communication and vaccines. He has expressed concern that we cannot rush this vaccine because if you have problems with the vaccine, you're immunizing healthy people. And so the damage from the vaccine can be greater than the damage from the virus. His concern is that they will try to rush approval of a virus prior to the election because of all the politicization that's going on both sides of the aisle. And that will be dangerous. So I would not hang your hat on a vaccine in the fall or before the fall. That would be, remember, the fastest vaccine we've ever made was mumps, and it was like 3 or 4 years. So this would be record time. And you have to do the phase 3 human trials to make sure it's really effective and really safe. So that takes time. Now, they're going to expedite all that, but it still takes time. So the question about lockdowns, why do you do a lockdown? We did a lockdown initially because we had incomplete data as to what would happen if we didn't. The concern out of King's College in London was that 2.2 million Americans get infected with unmitigated or even slightly mitigated spread. And not infected, 2.2 million Americans die. Something like 4 or 5% of everyone over 65 dies because the virus infects, 60 or 70% of the population until it reaches a herd immunity threshold naturally. That was terrifying, and we were seeing cases surge and hospitals overwhelmed. We were looking at Wuhan, looking at other countries and going, crap, we better do something stat. And at this point, since we didn't have testing, drop the ball on that, we got to lock down aggressively, like the Europeans did, like the Asians did. And so we did that. And what does it do? It bends the curve pretty quick because you're no longer getting a lot of mixing, you're social distancing, and people didn't account for the fact that there was also built-in effects that the population does because they're terrified because they watch the news. So they're automatically spacing out more. They're automatically putting on masks and washing their hands and paranoid. And that helps actually to bend the curve. So that's why they did the lockdown, to give it a chance to just squelch the infections low enough that then you could open up again cautiously, test everybody, contact trace positive people, isolate positive people instead of isolating the whole population. Just focus on the people that are sick. Give us time to learn how to treat it better, which we're already doing. So we don't intubate everybody. We use dexamethasone steroids for sick patients in the ICU. We have better protocols. Give us time to spin up capacity in the hospitals, more PPE to protect our frontline healthcare workers, and give us time to work on a vaccine. That was the intent of lockdowns. Now, what happens if people behave in a way that's, this thing's a hoax, or let's just go back to life as it was? Well, then cases surge, as they are. And if cases surge and the hospitals get overwhelmed and it becomes a dangerous situation where you can't take care of a gunshot wound or a heart attack because there's no ICU beds, well, then how do you control that? You ask people to do one of two things: social distance, wear masks, wash hands, do the right thing. If they're not doing that, then you have to lock everything down again to get the infections under control for a period of time, that the healthcare system can catch up, the science can continue to progress, and we get closer to hopefully a vaccine and better treatments. You can avoid lockdowns by just doing the right effing thing. That's really it. But I don't know in America, where we're so politically polarized, where not wearing a mask is a badge of a political affiliation and shaming people who don't wear masks is a badge of a political affiliation. We're so politicized, and science is not a political thing, despite what they'll have you believe. It's the rational approach to learning about the true nature of the world. And so we should do the science and communicate it clearly and use our faculty of reason and critical thinking regardless of politics. You can still have your political beliefs, but you really have to try to acknowledge and divorce them from the science at hand. And you can have debates and civil discourse about what the best thing is to do, because a lot of times we don't yet have enough data. So I don't think we should lock down again. I really don't. I was concerned about the initial lockdowns. In retrospect, okay, I get why we had to do it, but we could have managed through what I was saying early on, which is wash your hands, social distance. At that time, masks for the public were still like, are we really going to do that? Do we have enough PPE? Are cloth masks going to cause more harm than good? Well, now it's starting to become clear that I think the masking thing is beneficial. And I think we should be doing it, and we should be encouraging it culturally. And that's a shift for me because, again, if you're doing science and you're thinking reasonably, you have to recognize your own biases and start to look at data and change your opinion if the data changes. That's a crucial, crucial thing. And you have to stay humble in the face of the unknown. This is one thing I think the public doesn't really swallow in all this, is the fact that there's uncertainty. Scientists are used to that. That's the nature of science. There's uncertainty, so we try to become more certain by doing tests and experiments and equivocating. But the public sees that as we don't know what we're doing. Couldn't be farther from the truth. We know that we're approaching this in a way that we're trying to learn more and more and more in record time, something that we've never encountered at this degree in modern medicine. So the public needs to also be patient with scientists and understand that this is a process and it's going to seem confusing and recommendations are going to change. At the same time, we have to watch out for over-scientification and not looking at all the buckets of concern. The cultural bucket, the economic bucket, the mental illness bucket, and then the medical bucket. So we got to balance all those things. That's why we are supposed to have politicians, so that they can use politics to hash out what's the balance. But it's not happening. Instead, we're getting just either a super anti-scientific sort of bent in the administration, or a hyper liberalized bent of people who are, politicizing it on the left and saying, well, tisk, 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 you're not wearing your mask, and so on and so forth, and catastrophizing. The truth it is going to be based on the actual data and science, which we're trying more and more to focus on this show. So that's my best stab at that. Let's read some other questions here. These are great, by the way. Let's see. Where are we at? What do you think about states' parks being shut down? Should we not facilitate people getting out and away from each other? Albin Martinez. This is a great question. And I'm going to acknowledge a bias up front. I am very biased towards outdoor activities and getting people out of the house, because in the house, in enclosed, poorly ventilated spaces, where you get sick. I understand why they might have closed parks early on, because they didn't know and they were concerned, and are people going to be out on common areas and getting sick? There's really not a lot of great evidence that that's happening. It really just kills me inside when I see public health authorities closing parks and state parks and things like that, and asking that people wear masks mandatorily on outdoor trail systems. It seems anti-scientific, overly cautious, and with unintended consequences, which are people are going to rebel. They're going to start to disrespect authority. They're going to think that this is basically a nanny state, and they're going to not bother going outside, because who wants to wear a mask when you're huffing and puffing up a steep-ass trail in beautiful nature where you can social distance by 6 feet from other people? And there's an infinite volume of distribution for the virus into open air and sunlight and temperature and other things that are adversely affect viral survivability. Instead, we're telling people basically, shelter in place, which is the stupidest saying I have ever heard applied to this. Shelter in place means sit on your fat ass at home, confined in a poorly ventilated space, eating chips, putting yourself at more inflammatory risk of complications of COVID because you're stressed, you're fat, and you're not exercising, and you're not outside getting natural vitamin D within moderation. So it's insane to me that the public health officials have taken that tact. I went hiking with my kids yesterday on a 3-mile hike, and there are mandatory masks on the trail. And I had a mask in my back pocket. And I'm like, there is no effing way I'm going to make my children and I wear a mask when these trails are incredibly wide. There's hardly anybody. And when people come, we all do the courtesy of turning away and spacing out and walking by because we've culturally acclimatized to this way of being in the world. So some degree of common sense has to mitigate the fact that humans behave as humans. And we need to take that into account with our public policy. So that's my soapbox. I'm biased. I don't think there's good data that you need to mask on a trail. So that's me. What do I know? Okay, let's see some other questions here. Vaccine trials, should we sign up? What's your opinion on this, Melissa Smith? Well, yeah, you should sign up if you want to advance science, if you're okay with the risks and benefits of early vaccine administration. The current Moderna vaccine apparently does trigger quite a bit of immune response in terms of symptoms. So fevers, headaches, muscle aches, which means it's probably working. It's probably generating the immune response that the virus would generate, which causes remember, the symptoms of the virus are usually the symptoms of your immune response to the virus, not the viral replication itself for the most part. And so, that's actually a good sign. I saw Bill Gates on, somebody shared it on Twitter, and they're like, this is just feeding the anti-vaccine movement, because they interviewed Bill Gates about why there are such severe side effects from the early vaccine trials. And by side effects, meaning these just unpleasant experiences of headache, fever, symptoms, right? Nobody's infected. These aren't live viruses that they're injecting. You cannot be infected with coronavirus from the vaccine because they're not using live attenuated virus. So he was like, blundering through explaining this, and they're not that bad, and just bad. But I'm like, Bill, get a PR person to talk for your ass, because look, love that you're involved in vaccines. No one made you the spokesman for vaccines. You're a shitty spokesman for vaccines. Get somebody who knows how to talk about this stuff, how to think about it and communicate it. And because you're going to terrify people. First of all, people think you're a robot to begin with. They think you're part of some big-ass conspiracy. Bill Gates is probably the single biggest impediment to getting the vaccine actually taken by people. He's great for funding it. But what about getting people to actually take it? Are you going to believe this guy who can't connect with an average person, right? And again, this is not meant to insult Bill Gates, who I think is doing amazing work in the world. If you haven't seen the Bill Gates documentary, you should check it out on Netflix. It's really worth watching. It's just, I am passionate about communication because I think humans thrive on stories and on connection and on communication. So you can have someone who's got the engineering mindset like Bill Gates, build stuff and fun stuff. That's great. Just don't talk about it because you're bad at it. We need Steve Jobs back. God, I miss that guy. He would have just laid it out, man. And he would have not taken any crap too. He would have been like, you know what? I think we're overblowing this thing to the degree that we're generating too much fear. But hey, how hard is it to wear a mask? Here's a freaking eye mask. Even if it shuts people up about lockdowns, it's worth wearing it. Forget about all the data. If it shuts people up about lockdowns, it's worth wearing it. Let's see. Lynn Mason agrees about Gates. Linda Shin agrees about Steve Jobs. Will not have anything to do with Bill Gates, says Phyllis Goddard. Now, this is the thing. Now, see, that's, I think, also an overreactive response. Bill Gates is trying to do a lot of good in the world with his philanthropic money. He may not be right about everything, but he is certainly, watch the documentary and you will get a sense that people think he's in on some big conspiracy and these billionaires are controlling the world. They have no power. He has been stymied at every avenue, from his work on nuclear power, safer nuclear power, his work on water purification. I mean, things that would trip up a company trip him up too. So he's not this, all-powerful conspiracy leader. He's just a nerdy dude who made a bunch of money doing something he was good at, that's now, thinks he can fix a lot of other problems. Whether he's right or not, we don't know. But at least somebody's freaking trying, right? Like the Elon Musks of the world, him. These are the people we ought to be elevating and celebrating, not some dipshit on the internet who sits there sniping. And I'm not talking about your comment. I'm talking about other people. The death of expertise in this country has been such a huge blow to the progress and rationality of our species. I still think we're getting better, but it's like, guys, you're going to believe some chump conspiracy theory sitting in his room eating Cheetos over, say what you will about Fauci. I don't give a F about Fauci. Fauci's an expert. He spent a career doing this stuff. His name is on Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine that we all learned from back in the day, us of a certain generation. I've been on calls with Fauci around Ebola, back when Ebola was a thing. And I found him to be very measured, not a catastrophist, doesn't catastrophize, very informed, and knows what he's talking about. Is he the only person you listen to? No. But you better start listening to scientists about stuff, because they actually do this stuff. Now, again, do they have biases? Sure. Is it all coming to a head now? Absolutely. But there are some that are better than others. Now, so that's the thing. I think we can't just sit here and snipe at these experts. It feels bad too, because it feels like they're telling us all kinds of different things. We don't feel like we have a sense of control or power. That's going to definitely make it harder for us to accept any of this shit, right? Sorry, I wasn't really intending to curse. I'm going to back it off because I know people get mad at me who want to share it with their mom. And I get it. That's why I decided to put something better than a t-shirt on to talk to you guys. People don't believe I'm a doctor sometimes, right? And then I put the thing on. Now I'm an expert. Now no one trusts me. So it's like, it's this deadly balance. Let's see. The problem with conspiracy theories is they assume someone out there knows what they're doing. Suraj Nagar. Exactly. This is something I say time and time again. The problem with conspiracy theories is people assume someone out there knows what they're doing, and they don't. There are real conspiracies that happen, like the Volkswagen conspiracy to hide that their diesel engines were filthy. That's a legit conspiracy. And it got caught. Why did it get caught? Because people are dipshits. Sorry, I'm cursing again. Reporters, others, journalists, scientists figured out, no, there's an anomaly here, and exposed it. Now people are saying, oh, but you see Judy Mikovits in the pandemic. She's a scientist. No, she's not. She had her one big publication retracted by the journal Science for being wrong and unreplicatable. She's an anti-vaccine activist. She's been at it for years. That's not an expert. She's saying Fauci and these others had conspired to make this artificial thing and make money for big pharma. They're not that smart at that stuff. They really aren't. There are so many easier ways to make money, you guys. So many easier ways than pulling off $1 trillion scam and keeping the public in the dark at a level that would take constant work and cultivation. You're delusional if you think that. I know these people. I know people at the CDC. I know people at WHO. I know people in government in the healthcare sector. They are not smart enough to pull something, or coordinated enough to pull something like that off. They're all smart, good people trying to do the right thing, but they don't have that ability. Trust me. Get off that soapbox. I've done videos on this, by the way, on why conspiracy theories happen and how to recognize them and so on. Scientists do team up and conspire with each other, so it's nonsense when people act like as if the experts have little credibility. Jason, I'm not sure how to interpret that, so I'm going to move on. I'm misreading it or something. Does compassion matter in all this mess? Vincent DePaul Tran. Appreciate your straight shooting attitude, by the way. Compassion. I would argue that compassion is the central issue in all of this. What is compassion? And is it the same as empathy? People conflate the two terms, and I've done videos on this. Empathy is feeling someone else's pain as if it was your own and acting from that feeling. So who can I empathize with? Can I empathize with a group of people? Can I empathize with a country? Can I empathize with a statistic? Can I empathize with a tribe? Not so much. Empathy is a narrow spotlight. That's why people in the charity space have known for years, if you want to get donations, don't tell them millions are dying in Africa. Let's save millions. You show them a picture of a single African girl who is starving, who you would help if you gave money. Why? Because you empathize with that girl and her immediate family and her immediate situation. We do not empathize with abstract concepts such as famine and millions of people. We're not designed for that. So empathy is tremendously harmful. Why? It's not harmful for your family and your kids and your immediate, because you do want to be able to feel what they're feeling and act and understand better. It causes you to make incorrect decisions based on emotion. It causes you to burn out because you're feeling that. Oh, that poor girl, right? And you bring it home, especially if you're a healthcare worker. I empathized with this patient today that was addicted to opioids, so I had to relieve their pain. I gave them the Demerol or the Dilaudid or the whatever it is, the drug of the month, and nobody uses Demerol anymore. And but when I was training, that was the one everyone wanted. The only thing that starts with a D, I'm like, Demerol. Now it's Dilaudid. You give them it instead of doing the hard discussion, right? So, and again, you're only empathizing with, like, people have gone to war over an individual problem, like this happened to this person or this tiny group of people, not thinking of the massive amounts of suffering that would unleash. So empathy is garbage. Compassion, which you asked about, is the solution. Compassion involves a couple of things. And the simplest way to think of it is love and concern in the face of suffering. I'm going to repeat that. Compassion is love and concern in the face of suffering. I can see people dying of COVID around the country en masse and feel that they are conscious beings like myself who share the same fundamental aspect of reality, which is they have an experience. They are aware. They are being at this time. That's why we call them human beings. And that awareness is common to all of us. So that they are suffering, in pain, dying, having families who can't visit them, that they are suffering or could suffer. Step one is I have to recognize that. So I have to have cognitive empathy, not affective, emotional empathy where I feel someone's pain. Cognitive empathy is where you understand what someone is feeling. You can understand that they're having pain or they're going through something terrible without taking that on yourself. Step one. Step two is you then have to care about it. You have to feel love for that person or people or group or country or whatever it is, and want to see the suffering lessened, which means sometimes difficult decisions that may increase suffering in the short run. It may mean a little bit of a change in your personal behavior, maybe throwing a mask on, maybe washing your hands so that you don't infect someone who could suffer or whose family could suffer. Love in the face of suffering is inexhaustible. It never runs out. It doesn't cause burnout. And you can practice it. There are prayers and meditations, totally secular meditations on metta or loving kindness. Feeling the love, generating the feeling of love for others, and then the desire wishing them well. It's inexhaustible. It's associated with more happiness, more peace, more contentedness, better actions in the world. So compassion, love, the Beatles said it. love is the answer to COVID and everything. Okay, I'm off my soapbox on that. Meditate if you don't already. All right, where are we at now? Thanks for everybody who's sending stars. A quick recapitulation of what we're doing. We're just taking questions on COVID-19. We have been doing this for quite a while now, an hour and 15 minutes, and I'm ready to continue because I'm enjoying this. And I think it's a chance for us to converse about this important topic with rationality and a little bit of emotion. Everyone who's sending me stars, I get a penny per star for our show that supports our team and all our expenses. And you guys also show that you care about what we do. And I read your comments after the fact and go through and try to like as many as I can. So, and people who want to go in deeper, support us for $4.99 a month, actually become part of the supporter tribe. You get a closed discussion group. You get live shows with me almost every night that are very informal and a lot of fun. And you get a group of people that just are so awesome. They are so awesome. They are super, super fans of Health 3.0 and doing the right thing in medicine. Most of them are in healthcare, but some of them aren't. And they're just a lovely, beautiful tribe of people that I love connecting with as much as I can. So $4.99 a month, you support our show, but you also get a lot in return, much more than the price of the mochaccino latte grande that you're paying. All right, that's my shill pitch. We also sell merch, but don't worry about it. Judy Kraus. I recently ran in my local, come back here. No, Judy, where did it go? God, these things just keep scrolling. Let me find you over here. I can't keep up with them because the minute I start to read it, 30 more comments come in and scroll it back. Oh, Judy, there you are. I recently was in my local hospital and was shocked to see a dozen staff in the ER without a mask. We're the worst, especially in break rooms. Everyone takes their mask off because we're tired, right? But that's how you spread that. That's how that you got it. If you're in a hospital, you've just got to be masked up when you're around anybody. Period. No excuse. Let's see. I'm the Jerry Lewis of COVID. That's right, Emily Anderson. It's a telethon. You can support a starving Z-Dog and Logan and Victoria and my whole team. Oh, wow. Marguerite Cross just sent 1,000 stars. That's $10. Thank you so much. Thanks for all you do to further truth and reason. I'm going to pin your comment. Oh, shit. I was. There we go. Marguerite, you are now pinned for your 1,000 stars. Let's read some more comments. Bigger questions are why testing is still such a mess in the U.S. Is it merely a matter of such, unfocused direction, leadership at the federal level? What are the other factors? Daryl Kinton, there are a lot of factors. Yes, leadership. Yes, some bad luck with CDC and leadership. The individual companies each have proprietary aspects of their testing that then supply chain disruptions or bottlenecks can affect. So, there's companies like Cepheid and Abbott. They all do the testing, they spin it up. But if there's one part of the supply chain that's a bottleneck, like a swab, they can only do so many tests in a day. So that's a problem. And then the turnaround time is slow now because of bottlenecks there. So it's a problem. It really is. And we have to do better. We needed a federally coordinated approach, but we don't have one. So there's that. Now, again, I don't care about the politics of this in the sense that I can see all sides of the politics. And I've done shows about this, but the very basic truth is we do need a more science-minded leadership that is actually carefully approaching what is the role of government in leading during a public health crisis, and then step back from everything else it doesn't need to do, right? It's very important. And again, I'm editorializing a bit. So I apologize for that. What do you think about the Swedish model? Some politicians think it's the best way to get through this. I don't, but I want your opinion. Jason Petra. Great question. Let's talk about Sweden. So Sweden, very controversial, very politicized, but this is what they did. Now, they have a cohesive population that's fairly ethnically homogenous. They have built-in social isolation because something like, I forget what it was, 60% of Swedish households are single person. I forget what the number is. It's quite high. And they have a high degree of trust and faith in both their government and their healthcare system pre-existing, which we don't have here. And they have a centralized control of healthcare system as well, which allows for spinning up of ICU capacity, et cetera. So in the beginning, they said, we're going to take an approach where we don't want to do any mandates for lockdowns and things like that. We did ban gatherings of 50 people or more and ask people to work from home wherever possible. And the Swedes actually automatically complied. They dropped public transportation use by like 50%. They spaced out, but there wasn't universal masking and there wasn't universal social distancing, and the bars and the restaurants were open. What ended up happening? Well, they did get a higher mortality rate per capita than their equivalents in Scandinavia, but lower than the UK. They screwed up initially in protecting the most vulnerable, which were the nursing home patients. So a lot of their mortality came from very old people in nursing homes that were like sitting ducks. What happened with their economy? Well, their economy took a hit, not as bad as a hit as others, but because it's based on trade and all the other economies were shut down. So they didn't really get the benefit of staying open in the sense that the economy still took a bad hit. And what does the public think? Well, public perception has decreased. In other words, it's gotten less favorable towards this approach, but still not terrible. And how are they doing overall? Well, not that bad, really. It's not the end of the world, which means the catastrophizing of the left is overblown. The, just open up of the right is also overblown. The truth is somewhere in between because the people there actually behaved differently. It wasn't just wide open, no lockdown. It was, well, no, gatherings are restricted. People are behaving. They never overwhelm their healthcare system because they have good capacity and good governance, good leadership. We don't have that here. So can the Swedish model apply here? Probably not in the way that they did it. It would have to be different. I think the equivalent of a Swedish model here is everybody wears masks, social distance, washes their hands. That's it. I think we'd really bend it. A guy from the CDC, Redfield, said that, and he's not known for his amazing science, that guy. He was a guy advocating for abstinence during HIV in the 80s. He was a darling of the right for that reason. Abstinence works. It just doesn't work. You know what I mean? You're not going to get people not to have sex. It's very, very tough. Ashley Ramirez, why do people keep coming back positive weeks after initial infection? Okay, so we already answered this one earlier in the very beginning of the talk, so you can go back to that. Why are so many people asking about MMR booster prophylactically? Because there's some evidence, Valerie, some associational evidence that people who've had MMR vaccination are less likely to get severe COVID. There is no causation implied there. It probably implies that people that aren't dumb enough not to be vaccinated, in other words, they actually got their vaccinations on time, they care about health and the health of their children, are probably just healthier in general and less likely to get sick. So we don't know that it's causative, but of course people have assumed that it is, so now they're going out and getting MMR boosters that they don't necessarily need. It's not going to hurt them, but they don't need it. What they should do is make sure their kids are vaccinated on time and on schedule instead of being afraid of going to the doctor, which is what everybody is right now because of the COVID. So there's that. Let's see. Other questions that I'm interested in here. Let's see. Steven Spiller, big fan of your show. It's really helped me analyze my risk and stay informed, which is important being immune compromised by steroids due to idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Yes. And the fibrosis itself is a risk factor because it's an intrinsic lung disease. So stay well, my friend. For you, masking, social distancing, staying away from risky interactions is going to be crucial. And keeping as healthy as you can otherwise. Let's talk about that for a second. Not eating crap, exercising, going outside, reducing stress, meditating, sleeping better. These are key things to reducing your tendency to inflammation that would put you at higher risk of complications, even if you do get infected with the coronavirus. Very, very important. All right, we've got an hour and 24 minutes. Let's take Katie Hodak's question. How will they decide who gets the vaccine first? Elderly, healthcare workers, teachers? Great question. historically, it's always been those at most risk initially. Healthcare workers, the elderly, people with comorbidities would probably be first. And then you'd want other people because you want to generate herd immunity to protect people who can't be vaccinated or who didn't get vaccinated or who, this is another thing people don't understand. Not everybody responds to the vaccine. Everybody's immune system's very complex. Some people don't mount responses. Ask anyone who hasn't mounted a response to hepatitis B. And you're always tested, or MMR, and you're tested and there's no antibodies. You're like, what happened? Or no response. No, the titers are negative. It's like, well, crap. Some people just don't have the response. And some people maybe have a different response than you'd predict and generate immunity in a different way. But that's why you need uptake by the mass of the population. It bothers me when the anti-vaxxers will say things like, well, you got your vaccine, you made your decision, what are you worried about? Well, I'm worried about that I'm one of those people that, or my kid's one of those people that didn't have uptake, or the little kid who's less than 6 months old who can't get the vaccine, or the little kid who's immunocompromised who can't get the vaccine, or the older person whose uptake and immune response to vaccines is small and is not going to have a good response to vaccine. We need to protect them from you, which means you need to get vaccinated. Bottom line. All right. That's basically the scoop. So I think we did a thing today. I'm starting to, run out of steam a little bit because it's a lot of talking. And I want to do this stuff justice. Maybe we'll take one more. What do you say? I'm starting to lose my voice. Thank you, Suzanne Rose. Jane Ferguson, what do you think of colleges opening back up? My daughter goes to BU. Jane, this is tough, man, because we know what college is about. Like, how many people got mono in college? You need pretty close contact to get mono. I struggle with this one because here's the thing. People have paid tuition. They have a limited window with which to get education. I think college is bull crap except for the socialization and the being there with other people who challenge your ideas. So I don't know how well distance learning works for that, but probably not very well. That's why I think the difference between a really great education and a crappy one has to do with the people that are there. So what are your mentors like? What are the other students like? And if those are good, that means you need to be with them, challenged, interacting, debating, having civil discourse, not fragilely hiding, afraid of words, going to your safe space, deplatforming people who come to speak. That's the opposite of a college ethos. So what's needed to do that is you need to be in college, preferably living on campus, ideally, if you can, or living in a dorm with other people. Well, that shit's risky, isn't it? Because those young people can get infected. And if they're obese or have a comorbidity or are just unlucky, they can die or get very sick or give it to other people. There's no perfect answer. All of it involves risk. So what should colleges do? I don't know the answer to that, but I would say, this. If people are comfortable with their level of risk, they should be able to go to school. If the professors are comfortable wearing a mask or a PAPR or a face shield and all the above at college, then they should be comfortable and allowed to do that. If they're not, they should be given distance learning options. Understanding you're paying a butt ton of tuition. Do you get a refund if you can't go to class and you want to go to class? That's a valid question. Loans, do you get loan forgiveness? What's going to happen with that? And these are very tough questions. Personally, okay, now I'll just editorialize. So this is what I think. Open the damn schools. Let people who want to take the risk take the risk. Understand that this is a bad disease, that the harm of not educating our population might outweigh that. Take as much precautions as you can, understanding it won't be perfect. And if we find that it's very bad and we're seeing deaths and large numbers of cases and deaths, mostly morbidity, you can change approach. That's my take. Again, is it the right answer? I don't know. It feels the rightest based on the data that I've seen. And again, but I'm also staking a stance and saying, these are the things I value. I value education, right? I don't like generating so much fear. I think it's counterproductive to us as a functional, rational society. So looking at it rationally and valuing education and critical thinking, that's what I would say. All right, great. I love you guys. This was a lot of fun. Thanks to everybody who sent stars. It supports our show. I'll try to go through later and like those comments. Share this video if you don't mind. I think I'll upload it to YouTube. Why not? I have it on a card here as a replay. I think there was good discussion here, and it's probably worth uploading. You can also support us on YouTube if you don't like giving Zuckerberg any money, because he takes a cut. If you'd rather give the Googleplex money. Thank you for the supporters of the show who are here in the comments and always representing. You're my peeps. You're my special fam. I'll see you guys later, hopefully. Maybe from home with the phone show. And stay well and stay woke. We out. Peace.